Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum, and we're absolutely delighted that we have such a wonderful crowd tonight and that you're here for our first talk of the fall season. We want to thank the Hotchkiss School and Salisbury School, and especially all of you, for contributing to the forum over the years. It's your generosity that enables us to have these talks and make them free to the public. We have a fine roster of speakers lined up for this fall. On October 18th, Douglas Schwartz, who's the director of the Quinnipiac University Polling Institute, will be speaking on polling and the 2020 election. He was here about 5 years ago and gave a brilliant, fascinating talk, so I'm looking forward to that. On November 15th, James Forman Jr., the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Locking Up Our Own, is going to be speaking about our criminal justice system. We now have a Facebook page, so I hope you will check it out, like it, and tell your friends about it. And we generally have videos of all of our talks posted on our website a few days after the talks. So if you or your friends happen to miss a talk, you can always catch them that way. Tonight, we're delighted to present Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Aside from his award-winning work for the Washington Post and the Times, Mr. Baker is the author of 5 books, most recently, Impeachment and American History. He also wrote Obama, The Call of History, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, The Breach Inside the Impeachment and Trial of William Jefferson Clinton, and with his wife, Susan Glasser, Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution. Lately, he's been keeping us up to date on President Trump's assessment of Hurricane Dorian's threat to Alabama, and the selection of Robert O'Brien, a lawyer and hostage negotiator, as his national security advisor. As a seasoned journalist, he can be depended upon to come up with some clever turns of phrase, such as describing Washington's gossip mill as, quote, the official whisper factory, and Mike Pompeo's rise to the top of Mr. Trump's team as the culmination of a rocket ride from obscurity. His articles are always well written and a reliable window into the workings of Washington and the presidency. He'll be signing copies of his books in the lobby after the lecture, so be sure to take advantage of meeting him and getting an autographed copy. So please join me in giving Peter Baker a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. How you doing? Everybody good? This is a heck of a crowd. Don't you have anything better to do on a Friday night? Seriously. I know. It's amazing. I'm delighted. Thank you very much. I'm really very thrilled and very pleased to be here. It's a great treat and a great honor. I can't tell you how impressed I am with Salisbury, with Hotchkiss. I was very lucky to have dinner beforehand with a handful of students from here and a couple of the other schools around here. They are remarkable young people. You guys are doing a great job of raising the next generation, really, seriously. Very impressive, very impressive. I want to thank Mary and Lee and Frank and Bill for hosting me here today, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here, and I want to thank my friends Alex and Nancy, who first suggested the idea. I don't see them here, but Alex is responsible for, here he is, right over there. Alex is responsible for our book, Obama, The Call of History, which is actually, it started off as a picture book, coffee table book. I'm not supposed to call it that, am I? They want it to be called a picture book. It's a picture book. And we had done a version of that when Obama was inaugurated about his journey to the presidency, and it was a lovely book filled with amazing photos by our New York Times photographers, really a striking work. And it was Alex's inspiration that we should do one at the end of his presidency as well, and see, how did it turn out in effect. And he was nice enough or cruel enough to ask me to write the text for it, which we did. And then it was, I think, a pretty good hit. People enjoyed the photographs, at least. President Trump has told me twice that he likes the book. It does. It has some pictures of him in the back, so I understand. His inauguration is the end of the book. But then we decided also to take it and take the text of it and make that into a separate book that's just a text-oriented book, and we kind of built it out into a fuller chronicle of President Obama's presidency. I think they're going to be outside tonight if you haven't already got them. I assume most of you already have it on your bookshelves at home. But Alex is responsible for that. He's responsible for the last 15 years for the books that the New York Times has published, which is a remarkable array of works. I urge you to go to our New York Times store to take a look. There are some truly impressive and very, very diverse collection of volumes by our New York Times journalists. So I'm here to talk about President Obama, President Trump. I'm here to talk about anything you want. I can do the weather if you want. I did bring my Sharpie. I'm going to be honest here, I don't have a speech prepared, okay? It's been a busy week. I started the week with President Trump in New Mexico and then California. We spent 3 days on the road. I happened to be in the pool, which is the small number of journalists who actually travel on Air Force One, who take turns, all 3 days. And then I came here, and I'm going back to New York, and then we have next week the United Nations General Assembly. It's a very busy time. We might be going to war with Iran. We seem to have a new scandal involving Ukraine. Who knows what has happened during the 2 hours my phone wasn't getting service. No, you cannot tell. It is such an extraordinarily different period. I woke up the other day at 6 in the morning, and I discovered that the President of the United States had already tweeted 29 times. 29 times. It was 6. He's very prolific. He's very early, and he's very much a news generator. And this has been, I'm going to just talk for a few minutes, but then I really want to open this up for questions. I want us to have a conversation. You guys play Brian Williams. I'll answer the questions. We'll see if we can talk about whatever suits your interest. But we're in an extraordinary time right now, and you don't need me to tell you that, but it's so true. I've covered 4 presidents now. This is President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump. And I had come to the point before President Trump took office of starting to think that presidents were more alike than not. Yeah, they're from different parties, and they have different ideologies, and they were different personality, but the truth is the things that governed our presidents were very similar, I thought, from each administration to each administration. The range of options they had, the way they went about making decisions, the way they went about a day, how they tried to manage the press, all these things were much more familiar from each administration to the next than you might think, changing from a Democrat to a Republican and so forth. And then President Trump comes along, and I realized everything is different. Everything is different. Everything about this presidency is different, which from a journalistic point of view is a good thing because it means we have lots of things to do. He has a full employment act for journalists. He's not wrong when he says that he has saved the news industry. I think to some extent that's true. Everybody's ratings are up. Everybody's subscriptions are up. The failing New York Times is failing upwards. We are, in fact, we have more readers than we've ever had in the history of the newspaper. We have more revenue than we've ever had, I think, ever. Our profits are up. Our staff is up. In the Washington Bureau, which is where I work alone, we have moved from around 70 full-time staffers to around 105, 110, something like that, basically a 50% increase. So this is a boom period right now in journalism because there's so much to do. When I started on the White House job 23 years ago, there were 2 of us who covered the White House. Today we have 6, and that doesn't count all the investigative reporters and the other people who cover the Justice Department and the Pentagon and State Department and all those things. And it's because so much is happening right now in our country and in our White House that we are trying to devote the resources to covering it as adequately as we can. But it's a challenging period, right? It's a challenging period because our country is in a moment of churning divisiveness. We are trying to struggle to figure out what we believe as a country, what we stand for as a country, what President Trump's election means, what we think of his presidency, where we agree with it, where we don't agree with it. And along with that, we are a news industry that is in the midst of transformation. The old models no longer work business-wise. We're all trying to invent new ones. Newspapers are closing. In many cases, the revenues have gone down in other places. And yet what's happening in journalism is, I think, actually also a revitalization, where we're inventing new forms of telling our stories. We're inventing new outlets, new types of journalism, new types of news organizations than we ever had before. So it's both stressful and exciting, I think, to be in Washington at this period, and particularly at the White House. I'm going to give you an example. I mean, I told you the day I woke up and 29 tweets had already happened. I think that was Wednesday. By the time the day was over, I had written 5 stories. 5 stories that Trump had basically generated. One was having appointed a new National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, as Mary told you, a hostage negotiator, which I think is good because some days I feel like a hostage. A story about the confrontation with Iran, which is going on, and the president's struggle to try to figure out what he wants to do about that. A story about his threat to California to slap them with an environmental violation. A story about the president's visit to the border to look at the new wall that's going up there. And I've probably forgotten one. I don't even remember at this point. That's what the Trump presidency is like. At any moment, some story is going to come along and be something you didn't expect, and you have to react to it. My editor calls every morning around 8 in the morning and says, "What do you think we're going to do today?" I'm like, "Why do we have this conversation when you know 2 hours from now it will be different?" And it almost certainly is. None of us expected that this week we would suddenly be writing about Ukraine and what might or might not have been said on a phone call between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine. And the challenge for our news organizations is to keep up with the pace of what's going on while not allowing that to be the entirety of what we do, right? There's so many issues out there, so many stories out there. We can't let just the latest tweet be the only thing we write about, right? The country has a lot of important issues going on, and it's not just what the president happens to be talking about on a given day. So our challenge is to do all these things at the same time and try to do them with professionalism and as accurately and as completely and fully as we can without getting lost in the whirlpool that we find ourselves in these days. But this is what the news industry is about. It's our job to tell you stories as accurately and fairly as we can. And we have been challenged by the left. We have been challenged by the right. We are told again and again that we are failing, that we are not living up to our expectations, and in some cases we're even the enemy of the people. Our job is to ignore that noise to the best we can, listen to the constructive criticism, ignore the noise, and try to produce the kind of journalism that matters, that's relevant, that's necessary, and that helps people understand what's going on in a meaningful way past the surface. So that's our goal, that's our mission, and I think we've never been more dedicated to it than we are now. You didn't come out, I think, on a Friday night to hear me bloviate. So let's make this a conversation if we can. We've got 2 microphones, I think, out here. Where are the microphones? Where's one? And there's 2. Okay, well. And I'd love to we'll just go out and have a conversation, and we'll talk about what matters to you, and maybe I can help clarify some things, maybe I can help explain some things, and maybe you can tell me where we're getting things wrong, and I can take your constructive feedback back to my editors. How about that? Can we start here?
Mr. Baker, we hear as recently as today about how President Trump and others believe he can do anything he wants to do, including shooting someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue. And the more recent thing with the New York subpoenas, not just him and his organization, but his accountants are somehow clean of any such action. How is this related? We also hear about something I don't understand as well as I should, the unitary theory of the presidency, and we hear about Kavanaugh being associated with that and others. Are those in any way related? is Trump counting on eventual Supreme Court support
Yeah.
for doing anything he wants to do because there will be enough justices who believe in the unitary theory? Or am I conflating two things that should not be conflated?
No, that's a great question. And so the idea, basically, we're testing now with President Trump the limits of the presidency. We used to think we understood what the limits were, right? But in fact, the limits often in the past were not legal limits or constitutional limits, but limits of our expectations, limits of what was politically feasible, limits of what was seen as being appropriate and where the line was drawn. The line was always kind of fuzzy. Presidents have pushed that line repeatedly, many presidents, not just this president, but things that other presidents would never have done, this president has chosen to try to do. And people said, oh, well, I guess maybe he can do it. Maybe, in fact, he does have the power to do it. The unitary theory of government, that the idea of, underlying a lot of this is that the president is the sole, repository of power under Article 2 of the Constitution for the executive, which means that the Justice Department we think of as being independent, but in fact, actually answers to the executive, which happens to be the president, right? So can he then order an investigation to start or stop? Well, they're saying he can, right? Can a president be investigated? Can a president be indicted? For a long time, the Justice Department has decided the president cannot be indicted while in office. This was based on interpretations by the Nixon White House and the Clinton White House. I wonder why both the Nixon and the Clinton White House would take the position that a president cannot be indicted. Well, be that as it may, that's the governing rule inside the Justice Department. It's not established by any court. We don't know if that's actually the right constitutional interpretation, but as long as the Justice Department says it is, no Justice Department employee, no prosecutor can act contrary to that, right? So what you're talking about with New York this week is a lawsuit, an argument that the Trump organization is making in office saying the president not only can't be indicted, can he be investigated, which is a different thing, okay? Traditionally, what we've said is a president can be investigated, just not indicted while in office. They can be investigated because you might want to preserve any evidence of any kind of infraction or crime that can be used after he leaves office, but you can investigate because it's important on a timeliness basis to make sure evidence is collected, and if you have any issues with him in the meantime, that's what impeachment is for. What they're taking the argument is one step further, saying, no, you just can't even investigate him. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how that'll fly, but I do know that in Clinton's case, with the Paula Jones lawsuit, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0, including his own appointees, that a president is not immune from a civil lawsuit. It seems to me if you're not immune from a civil lawsuit, it seems hard to imagine that you're immune from a criminal investigation, but the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on that. So would Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Gorsuch, with these two justices he's put on the court rule in his favor in a lawsuit like that? It's a good question, but I don't think it's a given. Presidents have found that Supreme Court justices have gone against them time and again. Nixon put 4 justices on the Supreme Court, and they ruled against him unanimously in the Tapes case, right? Those 2 Clinton justices ruled against him in the Paula Jones case. So it's not a given that Kavanaugh would necessarily agree with him, but he does share a view of executive power that is similar to what we're talking about, so he may be more sympathetic to it.
Hi.
Hi.
Given that...
Tell me your name.
Oh, Molly Fitzmaurice.
Hi, Molly.
Hi. Given that the Times and the Post have often competed for stories, I was wondering how much these recent attacks on the press have, in fact, brought you together to get a story in ways that you never had before, and are there interesting examples of that cooperation now? Yeah,
that's a great question. I used to work at the Washington Post, so I'm still friends with many of the people there, and I consider it my former home. And I want to beat them every single day. You know, that's what we do. We are in it together in the sense of we are collectively under assault, if you want to put it, or criticism as fake news or what have you, enemy of the people. So in that sense, we're in it together. But we want to beat each other on stories every single day. But that's a good thing. That competition is good. When I left the Post about 11 years ago, they were having a hard time. The money had begun to disappear. The readers had begun to disappear. The resources weren't there. The paper wasn't as strong as it had been in the past. But today it's back. It's back in a big way. They've got an editor who's really made a big difference. They've got an owner who's made a big difference. And it's good for the New York Times that the Washington Post is so strong as it is. Because when they get a good story, it means we have to work that much harder to get a good story. Now the danger is this competition means we want to get a good scoop, right? But we have to be careful. We have to be more careful than ever. We all make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. I think that the newspaper has a pretty good tradition of correcting our mistakes when we do. We own up to it when we make a mistake. We do have a corrections column. We correct it online. If we make a mistake, we want to make clear that we made a mistake. But we understand that any mistake we make now is used against us in a way that's far sharper than it ever has been before. It's been weaponized. Our mistakes are weaponized against us and used to tear down our credibility. So while it's always been important to make sure we are 100% accurate, it is absolutely, more so, I think, today because of the consequences if we're not. And so in this competition we have with the Post and with our other competitors, the Journal and the networks and so forth, we have to be careful not to allow our zeal for getting a good story to overcome our basic journalistic values, which is to say, make sure the story is right. Getting it right is the first thing. Getting it first is the second thing.
Thank you. Hi, Roxanne.
Roxanne.
Given that you've covered 4 presidents, can you describe what the difference is now for you and your colleagues, given that Trump has chosen to be his own director of communications and
Right.
everything else?
Right. It's a great question. As with everything, there are positives and negatives, right? I mean, for us, there are no more press briefings, right? The press briefing, which is a tradition going back decades, has basically been abolished. And I think that's a bad thing. Not that the press briefing was always illuminating, not that the press briefing was necessarily all that utilitarian, but it was an opportunity, and I think it still will be again with a future president, I'm confident. It was an opportunity where every single day a representative of the most powerful person on the planet had to answer questions that they might not want to answer, on camera, on the record, right? That doesn't happen anymore. What happens is the president answers questions, right? He talks to us more than any president I've ever dealt with, and I think more than any president probably, maybe ever. On Wednesday alone, he talked to us and took questions from us 3 times. 3 times. Obama would go a week without taking our questions. He would go 2 weeks without taking our questions. Clinton, Bush, not that different. President Trump, as much as he hates us, loves us. He really does. He can't, it's like, maybe it's an unrequited lover thing or whatever. He cannot break away from us. He wants to dump us one day, but he keeps coming back. And so he does take questions, and that's a good thing, I think. That's a good thing for our society. If a president of the United States, any president of the United States, takes questions, particularly if he takes questions any given day. Now, it's not a substitute in my mind for the press briefing because these questions are usually done in a format that is advantageous to him and not conducive to complicated questions, right? If he's standing under the wing of the plane, as he was this week, you're shouting over the roar of the engine to be heard. So you can't ask a question, Mr. President, what about the unitary theory of government, right? It's not going to work. You have to shout out pretty simple, straightforward questions to try to A, get his attention with all the other reporters, and B, engage, an answer in that kind of a setting. So you say, Mr. President, what about Iran? Mr. President, what about Ukraine? Not, Mr. President, on May the 6th, you said this, but on June the 12th, your Department of Agriculture did that. And how, you can't ask a predicate question with the roar of the engine. So he does it in a way that is, limited. So I give him credit for taking questions most every day. I think that's a good thing, but there are limitations to it. And in the briefing room with a press secretary, you can ask complicated questions with follow-ups and actually try to pin down the representative of the government who's paid by our taxpayer dollars on important policy issues. And that's something we don't have right now. Up here, right here.
Hi, my name is Nora. I was just curious about what you've heard about persons discussing the emoluments clause, and if he's ever had that approached him, what his response is when people bring it up.
Yeah, he is. He's been bringing it up the last few days. In fact, he brought up in a very mocking way at a New Mexico rally on Monday, the Emoluments Clause. He makes fun of it. His argument is that, Emoluments Clause, if anybody doesn't know, I bet 4 years ago, none of us knew what the Emoluments Clause was, right? The Emoluments Clause is about, foreign money to our presidents. His argument is, I'm losing so much money by being president. No, that's what he says, that it doesn't matter if some people stay at my resort in Scotland, or it doesn't matter if some Arab, princes are renting a hotel room from my Trump Tower or Trump Hotel in New York or whatever. He literally says, I am losing billions of dollars by being president. Now, I don't know. I've never seen any accounting of that. It's hard to imagine that he's losing billions of dollars. His company's still in business. His kids are running it. But it's hard to know. I mean, the courts have not yet embraced this argument that his critics have made, which is that the Emoluments Clause makes what he's doing unconstitutional. It may get to that point, but for the most part, these suits have either been dismissed because of standing, the person didn't have the right to bring this suit, or then now I think one has just been reinstated, so it's going to still work its way through the courts until we get an answer on it. There isn't evidence that I've seen that he is telling people to go stay in his hotels or whatever. What seems to be happening is people think that's a good idea, that they will curry favor, or that they will just, get on his good side by saying, gosh, sir, I stay at the Trump Hotel, it's a great hotel. And they know that he loves that. I mean, he promotes his business using his Twitter account. And his argument the other day, we were talking to him about it, he said, well, George Washington ran his business from his presidential, well, he ran a farm, right? A farm, it wasn't, so anyway, whatever, but I mean, I'm not a lawyer again, but it seems a little different than what George Washington was doing. And George didn't use his Twitter account that way, that's true. We'll see what the courts say. Clearly, the lesson that people have gotten around the world is find ways of patronizing his businesses. Whether he has done anything to encourage that explicitly or not, that's clearly what a lot of people think.
It's Kent.
Kent.
Given your observation of the president's communication skills that you've commented on several times, and his effectiveness 3 years ago, in his campaign, what kind of candidate and what communication strategy would be best to take on Trump next year? I'm not asking for who, but
Yeah.
just what?
The great thing, Kent, is I am not a political consultant, and I don't know the answer to the question. It's a good question, though. No, it's a good question, right? And it goes to the heart of the Democratic debate right now. What is going to be successful against a president or a candidate that they have never encountered before, right? No presidential candidate has ever run against somebody like Donald Trump before 2016. They just haven't. He broke all the rules. He broke all the eggs. He showed a very different way, and it worked for him. I don't know that it works for anybody else, but it works for him, right? I think other people have tried to be Trumpian in their, I think it's specific to him. He is, it's very sui generis. Does that mean a Democrat should be like Trump in getting up on a stage and be very aggressive and very, combative? I don't know. I think authenticity matters. We were talking about this at our dinner earlier. Like, I remember Marco Rubio got up in the 2016, he tried to be very, get in his face or whatever. And I don't think it worked because it didn't seem authentic. It didn't seem like who he was. So I think the trick for whoever's going to run against him is they have to find a way to be authentic at the same time they are taking him on. He is a master counterpuncher, and a master puncher too, for that matter. And I think his skill has been seen is to find the weakness of his opponents and to really drill in on it again and again and again, in ways that get under their skin, that get in their heads, that throw them off balance, and that encourage a public impression, an image of whoever's opponent is, that really sticks, right? Crooked Hillary, low energy Jeb, Lion Ted. I mean, these sobriquets sound juvenile or playground-esque, and yet they have worked. And he's picked the thing that most, claws away at the scab of his opponent. I honestly think, I don't know Elizabeth Warren, but I think for a long time she looked really defensive on this whole, Indian blood thing. Pocahontas, he likes to say. Pocahontas is just such a racially charged thing, and yet somehow she's been the one on the defensive. And I think that she's only recently begun to sort of seem to move past that and not seem to be reacting to him the way she seemed to be earlier. So he gets under their skin, he gets into their heads, and I don't know, I wouldn't presume to give anybody advice, but it's the real challenge for next year for anybody running against him is going to figure out how to deal with that and seem authentic. So.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Rochelle.
Hi.
As a former journalist, I'm not going to make this a political question, but I think that Trump's Twitters are an amazingly successful communications strategy.
Yeah.
He has you guys jumping through everything. Just as Obama's campaign online to get money when he was running was amazing.
Yeah.
So as you see journalism and the news media, I see YouTube, people on YouTube becoming famous, in the matter of weeks. As someone who is daily entrenched in the communications business, what do you see as future dynamics, changes, innovations in how the news is communicated, how politicians communicate, how, what's on the horizon that, that might stick, evolve? What might we look forward to?
Yeah, I think you're right. He's not the first president to try to find a way to get around the news media, right? Obviously, Reagan started the radio address on Saturdays to try to get past the filter of the news media, and Clinton did it on the internet and so forth. The truth is, though, it didn't really start to work until Obama, and I think he did begin to, because of the proliferation of social media, because of the proliferation of different communications methods out there, he was the first one to begin to actually successfully communicate his message past us. He didn't do it through Twitter, but he stopped basically giving interviews to folks like us and started giving interviews to YouTube stars and doing, more, the Between the Ferns, right, thing, and Seinfeld coffee thing, and he found other ways of getting his message out. When Obama started, I had a number of interviews with him in his first 2 years in office, and then he stopped talking to me. After 2010, he never gave me an interview again. I'm not sure he gave that many to my colleagues at the Times either. He began to move away from the mainstream traditional legacy media toward these other outlets. And then Trump has taken that and put it on steroids, right? 29 tweets by 6 a.m., they're going to 64 million followers, and then retweeted and so forth, and they amplify and they control the agenda, and you're right, we jump through hoops, and the networks jump through hoops. And so we struggle with this question. I hear this all the time, well, why do you guys cover the tweets? Maybe you shouldn't cover the tweets. I'm like, these are presidential statements. They are presidential statements. The fact that they happen to be 280 characters or less doesn't make them any different than if he gets up in the East Room and makes a pronouncement. And we need to cover them in the way that we cover any other president. We need to scrutinize them for facts. We need to analyze them for implications. We need to get reaction. We need to help readers understand what they're looking at. If he just puts out, or any politician just puts out tweets, and we ignore them, for instance, then how do people know what to make sense of it? Do they have any other source of information that would help them put it into context, understand what is being talked about here and why what the president is saying is important? Now, what do we do as media to innovate? One thing that I'm too old to think of new ways to do journalism, but the great thing about the New York Times is, as much as we are the gray lady, they have hired a terrific young, cohort of generational change agents in our place who are finding new and more creative ways of telling our journalism through, visual graphics online, through podcasts, through, any number of different creative ways. And I'm all for that. I think that's great. I may be old school. I tend to sit down and type out 1,000 words, and that's my view of journalism. But the truth is, it doesn't matter how we get our journalism out as long as we're getting it out. We need to find ways of getting information to our readers. And if we do it in different platforms in different ways, that's a good thing, not a bad thing, as long as we stay to the fundamental journalistic values that have always undergirded our business, which, fairness, accuracy, thoroughness, balance, and those kinds of, values. So it's a challenging time. And, we're not competing with politicians, but it is our job to help make sense of what they're doing and saying, and not to let them have the only voice out there.
Thank you, Philip Oppenheimer. Maybe you could put some historical perspective on this for me and for all of us. You follow the presidency, but you also look at Congress. And I've never been so aware of how Congress has just fallen in place behind the president. And usually they're dissenting voices and so on. Is there any way historically, is that traditional? It just seems they're so controlled.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It really is. President Trump has done a remarkable job of making the Republican Party his own. And I wouldn't have expected that in 2016. It was so fragmented. They were so divided, right? Even just weeks before the election, the chairman of the Republican Party said that their candidate should get out of the race, right? Paul Ryan was like, I take back my endorsement. They were so divided, you would never have thought that he could have come in and bring the party behind him. Now, he's done it by, in effect, excommunicating people who stood up to him and didn't like him, right? Ask Jeff Flake, ask Bob Corker. And the lesson for those who remain is it doesn't pay to get on his bad side. And he has managed, therefore, to, even though the Republican Party officials don't like him any better than they did in 2016, they have come behind him and are staying loyal to him in a way I don't think I've seen any president's party before. Some of that's because some of them think he's probably been more successful than they imagined. The economy is doing well. They're happy about that. If his boat, is risen on the high tide, so might theirs be. They agree with him on some policy things like the deregulation and the tax cuts and so forth. The courts are very important. I think he just confirmed his 150th federal judge, right? So Mitch McConnell has turned the Senate into a confirmation factory. That's been his number one priority these last 3 years. So those things have meant some Republicans actually have fallen in line because they actually think that, things are going okay for us. I'm okay with these outcomes. These are policy things I support. Some of them are behind him because they're afraid. They don't want to get on his bad side and get a tweet storm or what have you, or have a primary challenge which would take them out. And some of them are just waiting him out, see what happens in next year's election, and then they'll try to figure out what the Republican Party is going to do going forward. But you're right. I think that the solidarity right now on the Republican Party, on the surface at least, is a big change. I don't remember that with President Clinton and the Democrats. I don't remember that with President Bush and the Republicans. I don't remember that President Obama and the Democrats. They were certainly popular with their parties at various points in their presidency, but never, I think, to the way that this president has mastered his party.
Hi, Richard here. Of the one economic issue that really matters, which is our trade deficit to China, the president has shown some apparent bravery in taking on that issue with tariffs. And between now and Christmas, we American consumers will accumulate the 1/3 of $1 trillion trade deficit, the $350 billion trade deficit, which will empower China and weaken us irrevocably. Do you think Trump will use the bully pulpit to inform and educate American consumers and push us to save the tariffs and make them work? unlike the other presidents who did not address the issue?
That's a good question. He doesn't use his communications platform so much to educate voters or educate the public in the way I think you're suggesting. Like, he doesn't suggest, we as an American people need to fill in the blank, right? Jimmy Carter came out in the cardigan sweater and said we all need to turn our thermostats down, and other presidents come out and say we need to come together for this great national purpose or not. That's not his style. His style is not to sit there and summon us to a greater purpose. He is taking on China, no question about it. It's a question. That's something that Democrats and Republicans have actually agreed on for quite a number of years, is that China was being a bad actor on the trade front. What is interesting about it is he has not made it a bipartisan issue in Washington. Pelosi and Schumer have been pretty tough on China for a long time, but rather than getting them together with him and coming up with a common front against China, he's made it his own thing, and he wants it to be his calling card next year's election. He wants to be able to go to the voters and say, look, I did it, okay? I did what nobody else did. I got China to back down. I got us a better deal. We're going to be a stronger country now as a result. They've given in. The question is whether that's going to happen. Not at all clear at this point. The Chinese they play a long game. They seem to be gambling at the moment that he won't win re-election next year, that they can stick it out over the next year and a half, and they're not sure whether we as Americans will look as fondly on him if the economy starts to go down. Yeah, no, absolutely relying on American consumers to continue the same patterns, absolutely. And I'm not an economist, so I don't know. I mean, we see sort of contrary indicators these days as to whether it's going to change in the next year or not. It's no question that the continued health of the economy has been one of the strongest points for the president. That all the polls show that the one thing most voters have said, yeah, I support him on this, would be the economy. He's taking a risk, with this trade war as to how that plays out. And I think he knows it, and he's nervous about it. The one reason you've seen some of the lashing out in recent weeks is he is nervous about the economy. He does know that's been his strong point. And he's blaming us for, he says that we are talking the economy down. I don't think that's what we do, honestly. I think we are trying to look at the indicators and trying to figure it out. Wall Street is looking at it. The markets continue actually to be relatively strong, even though they have moments of panic or concern. They keep coming back. How long will that last? I don't know. We're in the longest recovery I think we've ever had. So it's a very interesting situation right now. Yeah. Come back.
Donald Connery, you may remember that you were the Moscow bureau chief for Washington Post.
Yeah.
And you've also written with your wife a book about Putin's presidency. Now, I was the Time and Life bureau chief at Moscow for fewer years, and I was kicked out for honestly reporting the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I didn't have your length of experience. I'd like to ask you to do two things. Speak of your time in Russia and with the dates, whether you knew the Russian language before you got the assignment, whether you picked it up while you were there for 4 years, but more importantly, drawing on Washington and Moscow experience, what is the American relationship with Russia today?
Yeah.
And what light can you shine on Trump's viewpoint about Putin and behavior?
Right. Well, that's great. I want to ask you to tell us about your time there in the Bay of Pigs. That sounds more interesting to me.
No, not the Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis.
The missile crisis, I'm sorry.
1962, October.
That's remarkable.
For Time, Life, and NBC.
That's something. And what did you do that made you get kicked out?
What did I do to
Yeah. What did you do to get kicked out? What did you report that they got upset about? Did you report something that they got mad about?
Well, strictly, I think the major thing in my reporting at that time was that the degree to which the Soviet people were kept in the dark about everything going on in the world crisis. Unless they were listening to Voice of America or something, they simply had no idea
Right.
about the magnitude that the world may well end civilization. And so it was satisfying that Kennedy and Khrushchev worked it out.
Yeah.
And it was quite, as a journalist, to be able to go into the Kremlin every day and talk to Khrushchev and so on, and see the machinations as they worked this out with Kennedy. Okay, but then Time did a cover story on Khrushchev about his whole regime
Right.
and period of time after he took over from Stalin. And a fair amount of it was very critical. The Soviet people, or many of them, called him the king of corn,
Right.
because he tried to plant corn everywhere and it didn't work. And they got so angry at this negative view, which was inserted into a lot of the admiration for Khrushchev's not blowing up the world, that they just kicked me out. And I had the great misfortune to land in London for 6 years, just when the Beatles were rising.
Well, what a career. That's amazing. That is great. That's great. Well, I didn't have anything like that. Let me tell you, that's something. We arrived at the end of 2000, and it was the end of the Yeltsin era. It was just the beginning of Putin. In fact, we thought we were coming at a very boring time. Our friends said, oh, too bad. You're going for a boring time. All the interesting things that happened in the 90s are now over. Yeltsin's gone. You'll just have this boring technocrat named Putin. And we were there for 4 years to the end of 2004. And I mean, we didn't have a missile crisis, but I actually think those 4 years in some ways were the most, or as consequential as any other 4 years in recent times, because it was when Putin really came to power, consolidated power, figured out who he was, and set the course for where we are today. He has now been in office longer than Brezhnev was. He's been in office longer than anybody except for Stalin in modern times in Russia. And he's not going anywhere anytime soon. I think he's going to stay there as long as he can. And so our time there was really remarkable. We saw the closing up, the reclosing up in some ways of Russia. You know, when you talk about how they didn't know what was going on then, the time we arrived, they had been open to the world. They were beginning to get a picture of things that they had never gotten before. And during the 4 years we were there, it changed drastically. The people who returned our calls at the beginning no longer called us back at the end. They were afraid of being, dealing with Americans and so on. Didn't kick us out. Didn't make us feel especially welcome. But, Chechnya was a big deal while we were there. Terrorism was a big deal while we were there. I covered the theater that was taken hostage. You may remember in 2002, 130 people got killed. I covered the school that was taken hostage in 2004. 330 people got killed, most of them kids. Worst thing I ever covered anywhere in my life. And I also covered the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. But we loved our time in Russia. We thought the Russian people were wonderful. We enjoyed seeing a different culture. I didn't speak the language well. I did take a couple years of Russian, but I'm a terrible language student. My wife, who was my co-bureau chief, spoke Russian much better than I do, and still does. It got a little better by the end, but it was a great adventure. And we could travel in a way you couldn't when you were there. We could go all over the former Soviet Union, all over Russia, to places that were closed to reporters for many, many years. And so, such a great opportunity to explore a different part of the world. Now, about Putin and today and Trump, this is one of the central questions we've been trying to answer for 2.5 years. What does he see in this guy that makes him so warmly regarding him, right? I think there's a respect for a strong leader as he perceives it. I think that he clearly has a certain affinity for leaders who, he perceives to be powerful and decisive as he sees himself. But you have this real dichotomy in which the president has a very different view of Russia than the rest of his own government, right? Pompeo doesn't look at Russia that way. John Bolton certainly didn't look at Russia that way. Robert O'Brien, who just came in as national security writer, does not look at Russia that way. Dan Coates, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, didn't look at it that way. And yet the president does. And that is why we keep coming back again and again to the story that we're talking about today. For instance, what is he saying to the president of Ukraine? What promises is he making? What is his, is he following American interests, or is he in some ways favoring Russia? And if so, why would he favor Russia? Robert Mueller didn't answer that question for us. He concluded that there's no criminal conspiracy. He did not conclude that there was not contact, and quite a lot of it, between candidate Trump and candidate Trump's campaign in Russia. And so it's one of the questions I think that still kind of remains, not fully answered. I think I promised this fellow right here.
Oh, me?
Well, if you want, but then this guy here.
Oh, me first?
Sure.
Okay.
Ladies first.
Well,
Ladies first.
Anyway, that was a tough act to follow. However, I just want to say that I grew up in an era where you believed in things. You believed in doctors. I mean, if a doctor said, take a pill, have an operation, you took the pill, you hopped on the operating table.
Right.
If you believed in policemen, there was a little song that if you ever lost your way, you just, like you go to the kind police, and the very first one you meet. Anyway, you believed, and you believed in
I'm
New
not going
York.
to sing.
You believed in the New York Times, and you believed in the President of the United States. I am currently addicted. I have a love-hate relationship with MSNBC. And I am aware that they are, from time to time, as biased as Fox News, which I have tried to watch because I feel like I should hear the other side. And so I'm in a quandary that I wonder if you, as a media person, can answer, because the other thing that I hear is about the deep state, the dark state. It's either on my side or on the other side. I don't know. But, I mean, what are we to believe now? Where are we to find our information?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you have a lovely singing voice. No, you're exactly right. When we grew up, we had 3 networks and a handful of papers, and we all started with the same base of information, right? The same fact set. We then argued about it. What did it mean? I think this fact set means this. I think it means that. No, you're wrong. That was fair. It was a healthy competition of ideas. But we started with the same fact set. Today, everybody has their own facts, right? We all go to our own corner. We go to our own corner of the internet. We go to our own corner of the media. We watch MSNBC or we watch Fox. I'm glad to hear you say that you at least try to watch Fox. I tell people all the time, I'm on MSNBC, obviously. I'm a fan of theirs. They treat me very well. They never make me do anything that I don't feel is right journalistically. But even as I tell you, please watch MSNBC, please also watch Fox. Please watch the network that's different than whatever your indication is. If you like Fox, great, watch MSNBC every once in a while. Not because you necessarily have to agree with them, not because it's going to change your mind, but because we have to hear each other, right? And we're not hearing each other. We want facts that confirm what we already think, and it's hard to find anything that's kind of in the middle or balanced or trying not to take sides and to just give us everything we can use. And that's our challenge today. The great thing about this proliferation of media, this expanded marketplace of ideas that we have, is that we are now, no longer in the same room when we're having our conversations. And it's not just the media; it's us as a people. We are dividing ourselves. We are tribal in nature these days. It is physical as well as metaphysical. These days, there's actually a number for it. I think the number is 800. If you live in a place with more than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat. And if you live in a place with fewer than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Republican. In 2012, I think this is true in 2016, 95 or 96% of the most populous counties in the country voted for Obama. And 95 or 96% of whatever it was of the least populous counties voted for Romney. We don't live together. We're self-segregating ourselves in an idea way. We don't even want to talk to each other. In the 60s, they asked the question, the pollsters asked the question, would it bother you if your kid married somebody from the other political party, right? And about 4 or 5% said yeah. Today, it's getting closer to around 50%. You know, I don't want no Republican at my Thanksgiving table. I don't want no Democrat coming for Christmas. You know, we don't even want to be in the same family anymore. And this is a challenge. So I see what you're saying, and I totally agree with it. And that's why I do think the New York Times, I get that we're considered to be liberal because of our editorial page, and maybe because some people think our news pages are that way. The truth is we try really hard not to be. We try really hard to be that place you can come for reliable information, for not partisan information, but for, you know, fact-based reporting, fact-based analysis. I get that not everybody sees us that way. And so I don't have an easy answer for you. I do say that, you know, go to as many different sources as you can, because, you know, the more you go to, the more you're likely to pull together the best possible picture of what's going on out there. And don't rely just on one source of information, no matter how much you like it. I promise this guy right here, I promise.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, right, yeah, I promise him, but next up. So, fair enough, you're right.
Hi, my name's John.
Hi, John.
And given how deliberate and thoughtful President Obama at least appeared to be from afar, is there a method behind the madness of Trump? Because, I mean, from outside, it just seems, you know, that it's complete chaos.
Well, look, you know, it's interesting that, sorry, the question was, Obama seemed deliberate and thoughtful, and Trump is a different character, different personality, and is there a method to the madness, his quote, not mine. I mean, one thing I would say is that, you know, David Axelrod, who was Obama's chief political guy, said it well, I thought, once. He said, when we're looking to replace an 8-year president, we tend to look for a remedy, not a replica. You know, even if somebody's been successful and then we like them, we're looking for somebody new, somebody that's different, you know, to correct whatever flaws we saw in the last guy. So when we were done with Bush, we wanted somebody who was less of a, you know, cowboy, right? So we picked Obama. And now we're done with Obama, we picked somebody who was the exact opposite of Obama. And you couldn't find somebody more opposite than Obama than President Trump, right? And he is visceral, and he is instinctive, and he is impulsive, and he is not, sorry? Well, we can talk about it. I'm talking about that. I understand your point. I can get to that. But just in terms of how he deals with just day in, day out presidency, he's not a process guy, right? You know, Trump is all instinct. He's all id. It's all about, you know, what he thinks is the right course forward. And it's worked for him. And when you say to him, well, sir, wouldn't it be better if you had a process where you sat down with your Secretary of State and your Secretary of this, where, you know, look, this is how it's worked for me, it succeeded for me, why should I change? That's his view. It worked for me, why should I change? And as communications people, the ones who are actually there, try to say, you know, sir, maybe a little message discipline, stick to one topic a day, that way you get your message through. Doesn't want to hear it. He views his success at getting to office on the first try, as he would like to say. It's not really his first try, he ran before, but he didn't finish a campaign, as evidence and validation that his is the right way. And, you know, if you're a fan of his, then it looks appealing, right? That, you know, he's a fighter. He is taking on the establishment. He's not, you know, he's not this politically correct, you know, wussy politician who's just saying talking points. He's actually talking to us for real. Now, you get to the point of this, the truth thing. It's interesting, right? The Washington Post, my former paper, has documented 12,000, I think is the number, false or misleading statements he's made. All right? And whatever the number, we can debate, you know, that. There's no question he says many, many things that do not stand up to scrutiny, right? Day in and day out. He'll say things, you know, the media says I said this, but it's not true. And then, of course, you know, it takes about 3 seconds to find the tweet that 4 days earlier he said exactly that, right? He does that, and I don't know what that is all about. But a lot of people who really like him see him as a truth teller in a different way, that he's not bound by the conventions of the swamp, and he's telling us what really is happening out there. And you go to these rallies, you talk to people, they really feel strongly that he is being honest with them in a way that politicians like Obama are not. And it's a very, very strong sensation out there. And this idea of truth and who's really telling the truth is so interesting because it really tells us about ourselves right now and our own sort of tribal, differences where fact-checking, which has become a major source of our business, only goes so far with some readers. And his version of truth-telling is appealing in a whole different way to other people. So, anyway. Up there, sorry. I'm sorry I've neglected the upstairs.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Malcolm, and I've been sitting here trying to formulate my question. It was in 3 parts. I'm going to boil it down to 1. Do you think we'll ever get rid of him?
Well, that's up to you. Honestly, there's an election next year, and let me break down your question. I'll break down your question to 3 parts. Is there going to be an impeachment that will remove him from office? I wouldn't bet my house on it. Okay? I'm just speaking practically and analyzing it, not pro or con, not saying it's a good idea or bad idea. Practically speaking, the idea that there's going to be a successful impeachment seems very remote at best. Even if you got the House to go along with it, and that's not a given, but even if you got the House to go along with it, you need 20 Republican senators to break with him. And we just talked about how loyal right now Republicans are to him. I don't see 20 Republican senators breaking with him on the available fact set. Okay? If we learn something that changes it, that's, don't hold me to that. But there are not 20 Republican senators who are going to break with him right now. So no, he's not going to be removed by impeachment unless something drastic changes that we don't know about at the moment. Number 2, will he win the election next year? That I would not hazard a guess. That's not for me to say. I would say that a couple things. One is that on paper, he is in a tough position to win re-election. On paper, he has never once, not for a single day in office, had the support of a majority of the American people in the Gallup poll. Not one day. All right? That's the first time that's ever happened in the history of polling, that a president not one day in office had the support of a majority of the American people. His approval rating has remained very stable between 35 and 45% throughout his entire presidency. On paper, that would tell you, if you look at history, you say, well, that person can't win re-election, then how can that person win re-election? But, as we've seen, people who bet against Donald Trump have lost a lot of money, right? He has shown that he can beat the odds when we sit there and say, oh, there's no way he can win. So anybody who pretends to know what's going to happen next year, take with a grain of salt. If the question was, does the American public want Trump versus not Trump, the polls would indicate they would pick not Trump. But that's not the choice. The choice is Trump versus flawed Democrat, right? We're all flawed, and whoever is a Democrat up there will have flaws and weaknesses that he will use and the voters will judge. And the question is, and we talked about that, right? Where we talk about that? Right here. Who do the Democrats put up makes a big difference in terms of what that outcome is. On the third part of your question, if I've broken your question down into 3 answers, will we get rid of him, meaning, let's say he wins a second term, will he leave after 8 years? If that's your question, look, he jokes about that. He says, maybe I'll stay longer. I think they owe me 3 extra years because of this witch hunt that wasn't true. I don't really think that he's serious about that. I don't think there's any prospect in our system in which that would actually happen. Maybe I'm naive, but I actually don't think that's a serious concern. But, I understand why you say it. And what Nancy Pelosi has said was she worries that if the Democrats were to win next year's election, that it would have to be so decisive that there's no question about it, that the president can't sit there and say, well, it's been rigged, or I've been cheated, or, there are 3 million phantom votes out there that were taken away from me. So we'll see how he responds if he were to lose an election. But, this system is very strong. Our institutions are very, very strong. I think that we have worried about them, but I look around and I see a continuing thriving democracy that has succeeded and preserved through many, many challenges in its history. And I think we're stronger than any individual person.
All right. Hi. I'm Anne. I'm a junior at Hotchkiss.
Yay!
So you can clap if you want.
Yay, clap if you want. We can clap. Yay! He's a high school junior on a Friday night who's here to talk about her country.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
So I was wondering, you briefly mentioned kind of the idea of the extreme polarization that's happening right now between parties in our government. And I think we're all well aware of the way that news sources have swung to one side or the other and tend to propagate news that more leans towards the views of the people that's reading their stuff. So I was just wondering if you feel as a journalist obligated to stick to one side or opinion personally when you're writing and almost counteract the extremes that the people that are writing the opposite views may go to.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's a great question. You know, this era has challenged journalists to think about our preconceptions and the way we do our business. And what we've heard a lot in the last couple of years is, from our readers on the right or the left or what have you, is, you know, you need to stop this objectivity thing and just tell us the truth. And unfortunately, what people often mean by that is, tell us what we already think, right? Tell us our truth. Tell us that we're right. My view is, yes, this era has been a challenge for journalism. Yes, Enemies of the People puts us in a terrible position. It does not mean that we should lose our core values in journalism, which is not to take sides on the news pages. There's lots of parts of journalism that do take sides, and that's fine. I don't have any, you know, pundits, columnists, editorial writers, that's all great. That's part of our national conversation. But reporters like me, who cover the White House, who cover Congress, who cover the State Department, it's not our job to put our opinions in there. It's really not. I don't vote. I don't participate in political events. I'm not a member of any organization other than journalistic organizations. I don't give money to any politician, never have. And it's my job not to be a partisan. That doesn't mean that my columns or my news analysis pieces that you read in the papers don't have some analysis that somebody would say, well, that's taking a side or not. Our goal is to make them fact-based, not opinion-based, right? If I can analyze what the president is doing, it's based on facts, based on the events that are happening, on a history, on my experience, having covered other presidents. If I can bring that to bear to bring some context, that's different than taking a side or being opinionated. And I do not think that we should be countering anybody except by not being opinionated, except by being as balanced as we possibly can, so that for those who want to go to MSNBC and Fox, but also want to find somebody who can give them, isn't going to be, telling them which way to think, but give them the basic set of information. That's our highest calling. We don't always succeed. We are flawed, but that's our highest calling. And so your question is a great question, and it's really fundamental to what's going on right now. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. Great. Okay, hi.
Hi, I have one quick question. I was at a social function this Sunday with an investigative reporter from a network that no longer works for the network, but he and I talked, and he said, who do you think is going to run against Trump? And I gave him 2 names, and he said, those 2 names are probably okay, Buttigieg and Biden. He said, you know who's really going to run? I said, no, I don't. He said, Michelle Obama. What's your opinion?
I would take that bet. I don't think she's going to run, no. She hated the White House. She hated living there. She hated Washington and the whole, political scene. I mean, they live there still, but this was something she really didn't like. And you're right, she's popular. I get why people say that. Democrats love her. She sold 11 million books, I'm told, 11 million books. Her husband right now, I'm told, is really in kind of a state because he's writing his own book and he's feeling a little competitive. And he may not sell as many as hers, and he's a little nervous about that. Somebody told me, I think this is right, check me, because I've not checked this, but somebody who's in the book industry told me that Clinton sold about 3 million copies of his book, Bush sold about 3 million copies of his book. Michelle Obama sold about 11 million copies of her book, right? So she obviously does have a base, but she doesn't like politics. The question is, does she dislike the White House as much as she dislikes Trump? She definitely dislikes Trump. But I would be stunned if she could be. I just really wouldn't see it happening. It's just not her thing. She does not want to do it. I think we have one more.
Thank you. My name is Peter, and I'm concerned about the very heart of our Constitution, what we teach kids every day in school, namely the separation of powers. And I don't see that happening anymore. I don't see Mitch McConnell acting as if he is separate from the executive when he says, I won't touch guns, question until I hear from the president. I don't like the fact that president constantly stonewalls the committees of the House. I don't see that separation of powers the way it should be. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really is. And it's a fundamental question of where we are right now. What's interesting is since we had the Democrats take over the House, now, of course, you've got divided Congress. So you see on one side them doing oversight and hearings and subpoenas and so forth, and the other side not. It goes to our conversation earlier about the Republican Party being, in pretty much lockstep with the president. And you're right, a lot of people, including Republicans, are concerned that the Congress is giving up some of its prerogatives as a result. Democrats, obviously, on the House side wouldn't agree, and they're trying to assert their prerogatives as best they can. We'll see what the courts say. Some of these fights over subpoenas and information are ultimately going to be decided by the courts. And the fact that they're now saying that this is basically an impeachment inquiry would presumably, I'm not a lawyer again, would presumably give them a stronger legal argument in the courts to say, we're fulfilling our constitutional duty to consider this issue. The Constitution specifically grants exclusively to the House of Representatives the power to impeach. Therefore, to get information to fulfill that power, we have a right to this testimony, these documents. It seems to me, not being a lawyer, that that's a strong argument in the courts, and we'll see where that ends up. We haven't resolved that yet. What's interesting is how much things have changed in how Congress operates. I'm writing this book on James Baker, who was the Secretary of State under Bush 41, Reagan's first chief of staff and Reagan's Treasury Secretary. And it's just striking to me how much they got done across party lines back then, right? Ronald Reagan was a very conservative, partisan Republican who did a lot of business with Democrats, right? And the Democrats, Tip O'Neill was a very strong partisan liberal Democrat, did a lot of business with Ronald Reagan. Baker, as chief of staff, revamped the whole Social Security system with the Democrats in the early 1980s. Hasn't been done since. In the second term, he redid the entire tax code with the Democrats. Hasn't been done since. As Secretary of State for President Bush 41, he worked with the Democrats to solve the Contra War, which had just divided the country so badly in the 1980s. We don't see that these days. There are so few examples. One of our great smart high school kids at dinner pointed out the criminal justice reform bill, which is true. That did cross party lines. But broadly speaking, the parties don't work together anymore. And the problem is the political incentive structures have changed, right? When we were growing up, when I was growing up anyway, there was a political benefit, or at least a perceived political benefit, to working across the aisle, even if you didn't really. Right? You had a bill, you would get somebody from the other party, you'd come to the Senate gallery, you'd hold it, we're together, a Democrat, Republican, to have this bill. Today, you would be punished for it. The perceived incentive structure has changed. There's a disincentive to be seen as compromising or to work across the aisle. You will be punished. The risk is you will be punished for it. The gerrymandering has made it so that districts in many parts of the country, you have a greater risk of losing in a primary to somebody from your political left or right, depending on which party you're in, than you do by losing the middle and losing somebody from the other party. So the incentive structure has changed. It is no longer seen as a good thing to compromise. Will that change? I don't know. I don't know. We have gone through divisive periods in our history before. We have gone through periods of great division, obviously. You don't think of the Civil War, obviously, Vietnam, civil rights, McCarthyism, Watergate. We have been divided before. But right now, the Congress, to your point of separation of powers, has not figured out how to actually get things done other than to approve judges, which has been Mitch McConnell's singular priority for the last 3 years. So, okay. All right, on that note, thank you guys so much. This has really been fantastic.